At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Ranked #1 in innovation for 10 consecutive years and #2 among public universities for employability, ASU isn't just ahead of the curve, it's creating new paths to success. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online, that's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Criminology is a true crime podcast that may contain discussion about violent or disturbing topics. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 337 of the Criminology podcast. I'm Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford.
Mr. Morford, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. I'm wrapping up my holiday shopping and just making sure all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted and everything's ready to go. What are you doing?
Well, that's got to be done. I don't have a lot of shopping this year. My family made it very easy for me. They basically said, here's what I want. And so my wife is actually already wearing hers. She found a ring that she wanted while she was out looking for something for my daughters. And she called me on the phone. She said, hey, this is what I want for Christmas. And I said, well, buy it.
Makes it easy. They say don't get gift cards for people. I love gift cards. And I can just, give me gift cards. I'll just stack them up and use them as I need them.
Yeah, get whatever you want, right? All right, let's go ahead and give our Patreon shout outs. We had Bridget, Alexandria Kovaric, and Renaya Hilton jump out at our highest level. So that's some great new support. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to do that. It really helps out the show. For anyone else that would like to support Criminology, head over to patreon.com/criminology to sign up.
All right, it's time to jump into this week's case. And in this episode, we're going to talk about one of those cases that is truly terrifying. While all the cases we discuss are tragic, unfortunate, and heartbreaking, some are especially heinous and disturbing. And this is one of those cases. Many that we cover have clear motives, like financial gain or avoiding a loss of reputation, or they're so-called crimes of passion. Those where it's in the heat of the moment between people who know each other well when emotions are raging. Most of the time, the victim knows their killer. There are some crimes, though, that are completely random, where victims cross paths with very bad people with unthinkable results. And this is one of those cases. We're talking about the January 2007 abduction and murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom.
By January 2007, Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom had been dating for about 2 months. They were still very much in that honeymoon phase of new relationships, where they seemed infatuated with one another, and they seemed to be hitting it off really well. Channon was 21 years old. She was living in the Knoxville area while studying sociology at the University of Tennessee. This was her senior year in college, as she was set to graduate that December. Christopher Newsom's birth name was Hugh, but he went by Chris to all who knew him. He was 23 years old that January. After high school, he went to Pellissippi State Technical Community College, where he learned the skills he needed to become a carpenter.
On Saturday, January 6th, Channon and Chris had planned to go on a date. Of course, they were completely unaware that this would be their last night alive. For them, it was just any other night. Most articles and reports say that they went to a restaurant in Knoxville for their dinner, and then when they weren't ready to end the night, they decided to head to a friend's apartment to hang out and watch movies. Most timelines also state that everything was fine at 12:35 a.m. on the 7th because Channon spoke with either her mother or her father on the phone. However, as we look through the timeline put together in court documents, this is not at all how their night went. On Saturday the 6th, Chris was out golfing with his friends, and Channon was at her friend's apartment getting ready for their date. The plan was for Chris to drop his friend off and pick Channon up from the Washington Ridge apartments in Knoxville. They would go out for a nice dinner and then stop by a friend's to hang out. Around 8 p.m., Shannon's friend Kara left to go to a party. At about 8:45, Chris used an ATM to withdraw $100, and then he dropped his friend Josh off at the same party around 9 and told friends there that he and Channon would be there later.
From there, Chris headed to the Washington Ridge apartments to meet Channon. It looks like they may have decided to take her vehicle, a Toyota 4Runner SUV, possibly because it was easier to park in busier areas than his truck was, but they never even got to leave the parking lot. That night, Channon was sitting in the driver's seat of the 4Runner, and Chris was standing next to the car, and they were kissing. And that's when, without warning, they were attacked by a group of men. The couple was ambushed at gunpoint and forced into the back seat of the 4Runner. Two of the perpetrators also got inside the 4Runner, one to drive and one to keep the couple under control. Following Shannon's SUV was a third perpetrator in the car they used to hunt for their victims. Both vehicles drove to a small rented home on Chipman Street in Knoxville.
Friends of Channon and Chris were curious. When they didn't show up to hang out like they had planned, they started texting them around 10 p.m. And at first, when they didn't reply, they figured they either changed their mind or were busy and they were a little later than they expected to be. But when neither of them replied to anyone's texts or calls by 11 p.m., Josh headed to Kara's apartment complex to see what was going on. Chris's pickup truck was there, but Shannon's 4Runner wasn't. At around the same time, a Waste Connections employee working on Chipman Street at 12:30 noticed that the house at 2316 Chipman was lit up and there was activity going on. It stood out to him because all of the nearby homes were dark and quiet. Parked in front of the home was an empty Toyota 4Runner with its headlights on, and behind it was parked a white sedan. Later, this witness would have a frightening encounter with a group of men driving that 4Runner. We'll talk about that encounter shortly.
We know that this 4Runner witnessed by the waste worker was Shannon's, and the car parked behind it was driven by one of the perpetrators. It's very likely that Channon and Chris were likely already inside the home when the Waste Connections worker was outside. Their abductors fashioned makeshift blindfolds out of bandanas for both Channon and Chris, and they both had their hands tied behind their back before they were taken into the home. Maybe their abductors had forgotten to turn off the Toyota's headlights due to the chaos of the kidnapping. At 12:33 a.m., Channon called her father and told him she would be home by 2 or 3 a.m. The call lasted just 31 seconds. It seems this call was made under duress. Later, it was determined that this call pinged on the tower closest to Cherry Street, which covers this home on Chipman Street. She and Chris had already been kidnapped when this call was made, and it seems she was forced to make that call. What happened after Channon made that call is truly frightening and gruesome.
So obviously, Morf, this is a very scary scenario, and we're getting ready to talk about what happened to Channon and Chris. But, I want to kind of go back and talk about what people associated with them would have been thinking at this point. We've all been in that situation where, you were supposed to meet up somewhere, someone doesn't show. Maybe there's a party going on, like it was described here, or, a bunch of people hanging out. One couple doesn't show up. I think it's very easy in that scenario to jump to the conclusion that, they're running late, or they just decided they were tired and decided to skip the party. And then the other thing is that, at one point, Channon placed a call to her father, telling him about what time she would be home. And that really struck a chord with me because, both of my girls are in college. Even from home, I track their movements a lot of times on the weekends. Now, today we have apps to do that, and that's what I use. But I want to make sure that they get home safely.
Yeah, it's not clear if she made any kind of signals to her dad in that call, whether she tried to give him a hint that something wasn't okay. But in his mind, I would think that hearing from her that she's okay and coming home, unless he picked up on something else she said, he'd probably think, okay, she's out having fun, she'll be home later. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case.
Yeah, my thought is he would have probably thought this was a pretty routine call and a good call, right? She's calling, she's letting me know what time she's going to be home. I think for me at that point, I feel a little bit better as a father. My daughter has checked in and she's giving me an approximate time of when she's going to be home. Now, there's no way that he could have known unless, like you said, he had picked up on some type of signal, which I don't believe happened, that something was wrong. Inside the home, Channon and Chris were tortured by their captors, and what was done to them was truly horrific. Some of what we're going to get into is graphic and explicit, but we're sharing these details so that listeners can fully appreciate how depraved the people who committed this crime were. Channon was taken into a bedroom on the north side of the home. Chris was kept in an enclosed porch near the front door. He was almost immediately sexually assaulted. We don't know the exact order of things, but he was sodomized with at least one foreign object, as well as by at least one male. Later, semen was found inside of his rectum during his autopsy, but no DNA profile could be extracted. And we'll get into just why there was no usable DNA in just a minute. Chris was kept with his arms bound at the wrists, with a shoelace behind his back, and his legs were tied together at the ankles with a belt and a strip of torn floral fabric. He was gagged with a sock, secured with another shoelace, still blindfolded, and now barefoot with no pants. The perpetrators then took him back out to Shannon's SUV and forced him inside. A dog leash was placed around his neck to help the suspects control him, and a sweater was wrapped around his head, probably just to act like a very large blindfold.
The Waste Connections worker, who was an eyewitness, was still waiting in the gravel parking lot that was diagonally across the street from the home on Chipman Avenue. He was in the parking lot for quite a while because he was in training to become a driver, and the person who was going to train him that day was more than 45 minutes late. He took the time to go to a nearby store and grab a soda and some candy while he waited. When he got back to the parking lot, which was a little after 1 a.m., the 4Runner, which he had seen earlier parked in front of the house with its lights on, now was driving by him. The SUV slowed down as they passed him, and 4 male adults inside seemed to stare him down, except for the passenger, who seemed to be leaning back and slouching so they couldn't be seen. Their worker couldn't see much in the way of details, other than the fact the men all appeared to be African American. When the car made a U-turn, this worker began to worry for his safety. He called his father to report the situation. Luckily for the witness, the 4Runner drove by him.
And this Waste Connections worker, Morf, witnesses something that, later on is going to be very important. But what is it at the time that it's happening? It wasn't nothing, because he said he was worried for his safety, but he couldn't have had any idea what exactly was going on. Now, when he finds out later, I'm sure that would be a real shock. And I think there's a lot of people who have had brushes like this. And maybe they know about them because the details come out later. Maybe they never know that they had, some type of brush with a killer or killers, or maybe even a serial killer. That's kind of a scary thought if you think about it that way.
Yeah, I think in this instance, he had that gut feeling that something was wrong. And I think a lot of people should pay attention to that feeling when they get it, because sometimes there is something wrong, especially if it's, you're alone, it's late at night, and you've got a car slowly going by with a bunch of people in it looking at you. it's hard not to blame him for feeling like something was off.
Well, I'm a big believer in trust your gut. The 4 suspects ended up driving Shannon's 4Runner to a spot next to the railroad tracks, which was behind an industrial building, but technically just across the street from the home. The area would be basically empty at that time of the morning. Probably using the dog leash to help drag and force him, Chris was taken to the tracks. His bare feet tracked through the mud. Chris was then executed. He was shot twice, once in the back while he was bent over, which would have paralyzed his legs, and then once in the neck. Neither of these shots killed him. So one of the suspects placed a gun right up against his head and fired another round. This time, he was killed instantly when his brainstem was severed. The suspects then rolled his body into an old blanket, which they doused in gasoline and lit on fire. And I can't even begin to imagine what was going on in Christopher Newsom's mind. The fear. He had to have known that this situation most likely was not going to end well. And obviously we know it ended with him being killed, executed. It's really just, a horrific set of details. And kind of hard to think about.
It seems pretty clear that the setting of the fire was likely to try and get rid of evidence so that it wouldn't be linked back to the people that did this. And as we're going to get into, they did a lot more to try and make sure they eliminated evidence. Channon remained at the house the entire time captive. Once the group of men returned home, they horrifically sexually assaulted her. According to later court documents, when her autopsy was performed, she was found to have had extensive bruising and hemorrhaging to her genital area, as well as lacerations, showing she had been assaulted vaginally and sodomized, likely with a blunt object, as well as by at least 2 males. There was blood found on the vaginal area of her clothing, which had been taken off at some point during the assault. The damage was described as tremendous and grave. The medical examiner could also tell that she had been orally assaulted, because her frenulum, the membrane that connects the lip to the gum, was torn, and she had bruising and abrasions around her mouth. Channon had bruises on her arms, the front of her legs, her upper back near the neck, and the top of her head, and there were scratches and carpet burns on her lower back and her buttocks. The bruise on top of her head had extensive hemorrhaging, and she had a cut on her right hand. It's not clear whether Channon fought back and received these injuries during the struggle.
After she was assaulted, but while she was still alive, the suspects tried to cover their tracks. Bleach was used in an attempt to destroy DNA evidence left on and inside of Channon. The suspects forced it into her mouth and down her throat, and it was on the camisole she would be found wearing and had been applied to her genitals. Her body still had a chemical odor during the autopsy due to the bleach. All of her clothing, besides a sweater and camisole, had been removed. She was eventually found in what has been described as a tight fetal position. The suspects used strips of torn floral fabric to bind her thighs to her chest. Her knee was pressed into her cheek. Her ankles were tied together with the torn fabric, and a long strip was wrapped around her neck. A trash bag was tied around her head and face. She was then put into 5 different trash bags and shoved into a large household trash can. Sheets and other bedding items were piled on top of her body. She was still alive when this happened to her, and some court documents specify that she died from suffocation with her eyes still open. It's been estimated that it would have taken 10 to 30 minutes for her to run out of air, and then another 3 to 5 minutes for her to die due to the lack of oxygen. Channon clearly suffered, undoubtedly, during the last minutes of her life. Shannon's time of death was narrowed down to sometime between Sunday afternoon and Monday afternoon. She lived long enough after the assault for bruises to form and blood to start clotting around injuries. And just as we said, Morf, about Chris, there's no doubt what Channon went through is something that you might see in some type of horror movie. I mean, it's actually hard to go through some of these details because for me, it's impossible not to put yourself in the position of a victim. And in this case, what kept running through my mind is how horrible this was for her, how scared she must have been, hurting, and the fact that, she suffered greatly. When you think about the estimation that it would have taken 10 to 30 minutes for her to run out of air, and then another 3 to 5 for her to die due to lack of oxygen. I mean, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and you had to feel bad for her family once all these details would later emerge, to hear what she went through, to hear what Chris went through, both of them. Just a terrible ending to their lives. From an ear witness who was still up watching TV, we get the time of about 1:45 that morning when shots were fired near the train tracks into Chris. The neighbor, living about a block away, didn't call in any report of the noises because to him, the 3 popping sounds he heard did not register as gunshots. He thought they were just some young people out playing with firecrackers. The Waste Connections worker witness saw the 4Runner still parked outside the home at 6:45 that morning when he was getting off of work. We don't know exactly how long the fire was burning, but at 7:45 that morning, smoke could be seen coming from the train tracks. It was around the same time that Channon wasn't answering calls from her mom or her friend Kara. Shannon's boss called her mom to report that she didn't show up for work. This worried her, so she started calling Shannon's friends and even local hospitals. Finally, she looked up the number for Chris's parents in the phone book and called them to inform them she was going to file a missing persons report. His family, who had also been calling friends in local hospitals, also tried to file a missing persons report. It was clear at this point to these 2 families that they suspected something was very wrong.
Chris's body was not discovered until around 12:30 that afternoon. Approximately 80% of his skin had been burnt. Though semen was recovered from his body, it was badly damaged by the fire, rendering it useless for identification purposes. 3 .22 caliber bullets were recovered from Chris's body because authorities had told the families that adults were not technically missing. After just a few hours, Shannon's father called their cell phone carrier and asked them for more information about her device. He was told that the last ping was in the area of Cherry Street, which was somewhere they knew that Channon would never go because it was a rough area that she was afraid to be in. They decided to search for the SUV on their own. Around 1:30 a.m. on Monday, January 8th, Shannon's family found her car. The 4Runner was parked on Glider Street, just around the corner from the house on Chipman Street. It was extremely obvious that something had happened to the couple, and they called police.
We talked a little bit about earlier how this was really before apps and things. There weren't a lot of them online, I don't think, back in 2007. Definitely not like they are today. Today, you can track somebody right down to, an address. But back then, they didn't have those tools at their disposal. So I give Shannon's dad credit for thinking enough to call the phone company and asking them if they could ping the last location. And for back then, that was a pretty big accomplishment, I think, on his part, to be able to get that information and have a general idea of where to start looking, and it ultimately paid off.
Yeah, I'm with you. He definitely kind of spearheaded things, but I don't think that he really had any choice. They went to the police. The police said, hey, these people are adults. They've only been missing for, a short amount of time. They're allowed to do that, right? Adults are allowed to go missing. And that is what is tough in these types of cases. Obviously, Morph, the police can't check out everything. If somebody calls and says, hey, I'm worried about my friend, they're 2 hours late. There's not going to be a task force set up to try to locate this person. There's only so many resources to go around, but then obviously once all the facts become known, you would have loved for the police to have sprung into action, because maybe there was something that could have been done, maybe not.
From the outside of the vehicle, it looked different. Multiple stickers that Channon had placed on the windows had been removed. Why would she have done this to her car in the middle of the night before abandoning it? Obviously, it made no sense because it wasn't something she would do. Inside the car, more things were off. There was mud all over the floor mats of the car when Channon was known to keep her vehicle pretty clean. The seat had been pushed back so far, it wouldn't have been possible for her to reach the pedals. So it seemed obvious that she was not the one who had gotten mud inside the car or last driven it. There were items missing too. A phone charger that Channon kept inside the vehicle, as well as an iPod, were gone. Multiple pictures that she kept inside the car were also gone, along with the teddy bear that should have been there. A few bags of clothing that she had in the back of the car, ready to be dropped off as a donation, were gone too. One crystal clear clue that someone else had driven the 4Runner was a pack of Newport cigarettes. Neither Channon or Chris were smokers. While authorities searched the vehicle, they found an envelope from a bank in the back seat. It was processed for fingerprints, and they hit pay dirt. It turned out they belonged to a convicted felon named Lamarcus Davidson.
When investigators looked into Davidson, they found that he had rented a home on Chipman Street, just blocks away from where Chris had been left by the train tracks, and just around the corner from where Shannon's car had been abandoned. The house on Chipman Street was pretty isolated. For a home in a city, there were no homes across the street, just a large empty field, a lot full of used tires, and then the train tracks. There were also no neighbors to one side of the home, just the Waste Connections facility. Behind the home was another industrial building. That day, investigators obtained a search warrant for a home on Chipman Street rented by Lamarcus Davidson. As officers approached the home, they found the door to the home was slightly open. A TV inside the house was on, but it appeared no one was inside the 805 square foot home. Once inside, officers found every single item from Shannon's 4Runner. Chris's cell phone and driver's license were both inside the home. They had been burned. There was even a note one of Shannon's friends had written to her, and a photo of her mother when she was younger, Shannon's social security card and pay stubs, her iPod that had her name engraved on it, and a University of Tennessee commuter parking pass were also found. Even one of Chris's hats was found in the home. And it seems to me, Morf, as though police discovered a wealth of evidence, probably much more than they were used to finding in a situation like this. I mean, you have essentially everything from Shannon's 4Runner found in the home, identification, her iPod, and it was definitely hers because it had her name engraved on it, her Tennessee commuter parking pass, and there was some stuff of Chris's as well. I mean, this was really a gold mine of evidence.
Yeah, it would be hard to explain how they have all that stuff in their possession. Maybe they come up with a story, if they had time to put one together that they found it out while they were walking or something like that. But, having that link, having the physical evidence in that home was crucial. As police moved slowly around the home, they spotted 3 gasoline cans on the kitchen floor. There was also a bottle of bleach in the room. As they lifted the lid off the trash can, they discovered Shannon's body. The bedding inside it did not conceal her body very well. One officer initially believed that it was a suspect hiding from them in the can, and he actually drew his weapon. After he removed the top layer of bedding, Shannon's arm was sticking out of one of the garbage bags. Strips of torn fabric used as restraints that had been recovered from both of the bodies matched. Their tear patterns lined up. It was clear at this point it wasn't a suspect in a trash can, rather a very unfortunate victim, Channon Christian.
Lamarcus Davidson's palm print was recovered from one of the trash bags Shannon's body was found in, and it was consistent with him shoving her into the trash can in the kitchen. Police immediately put out a bolo for Davidson in connection with the murders of Channon and Chris. Police also learned that Lamarcus Davidson's brother, Latalvis Cobbins, a man named George Thomas, and a woman named Vanessa Coleman had been staying at the rented home since very early that month. Police wanted to talk to them to see if they had anything to do with the murders. A woman named Daphne Sutton, who was Lamarcus Davidson's girlfriend, had also been living in the house as recently as December, but they had broken up and she moved out. So police had some names of potential suspects, or at the very least witnesses, but the problem was all of these people had dropped out of sight. And we just got done talking, Morph, about, police finding a wealth of evidence inside the home, when here you have them recovering a palm print from one of the trash bags that Shannon's body was found in. When you think about a trial later down the road, I would think for the defense, that would be pretty hard to explain. Now, they always have their ways of trying to do so, but you think of a jury hearing that information. It's going to be pretty tough to overcome, I would think. But police also have, in addition to all this evidence, now a bunch of different names of people who, were either living there, thought to have been there, that they have to check out. I guess my point is, we cover a lot of cases where the information comes in slowly, in drips and drabs, or it takes quite a while for police to put things together. This case, as horrific as it is, it seems as though police found a mountain of evidence very, very quickly.
I think having all these names of these potential suspects or witnesses, whatever they turn out to be, definitely sped up the process in this case, along with the evidence they had. It seemed like, as you mentioned, they had a mountain of things go in their favor early on.
And it happens in some cases, but I don't think it's the norm, right? That police are able to gather so much information so quickly. Early on Monday morning, but after her family had discovered Shannon's car and before police entered the home, Lamarcus Davidson called his ex-girlfriend Daphne and claimed that the house was locked and his brother Cobbins had the key. She picked Lamarcus up and he stayed with her at her friend's apartment. The next day, Tuesday, Daphne's mother called her to inform her that a body had been found in Lamarcus's home. She wanted him to leave the apartment immediately, but since she had picked him up, she dropped him off at the Ridgebrook Apartments, where his friend Eric Boyd's mother lived. On Tuesday, Davidson and Boyd went to the apartment of Danielle Lightfoot and stayed the night. The next day, on Wednesday, Lamarcus Davidson was on the news, and when she saw he was sought by police, she kicked the men out.
On Thursday, Eric Boyd was stopped by police leaving his mother's apartment. He led them to a vacant house that he and Lamarcus Davidson had broken into and were lying low in. Police entered the abandoned home and took Lamarcus Davidson into custody without incident. When police searched his belongings, the pair of Nikes that had been stolen right off Chris Newsom's feet before his murder, along with a .22 caliber revolver, were found. So police finally had the one person that they were certain was connected to the murders, Lamarcus Davidson. After all, he was running the home, and his print was found on the garbage bag Shannon's body had been stored in. As police would soon learn, they didn't have everyone connected to the murder, and Davidson was about to roll on his partners in crime.
And I know I've talked about this before, Morph, but it does come up in a lot of cases. When you have multiple individuals involved in a crime, it can start out as, hey, we're all in this together. If one person gets caught, nobody talk. But it seems in most cases that pretty quickly it becomes about self-preservation. When faced with the police having all of this evidence I get the feeling that most of these people start to think pretty quickly, how can I save myself? And if that involves me pointing the finger at someone else, so be it.
Yeah, and it's lucky in cases like this that people do turn on each other, so more details can be learned about what exactly happened and who did what.
Lamarcus Davidson told investigators about 3 other people who were involved in the murders: Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, and a woman named Vanessa Coleman. But he left out his friend, Eric Boyd. Boyd was the driver in the car following Shannon's Toyota 4Runner. After the carjacking, he had driven the other attackers in his cousin's car, which he borrowed, and followed them home after they forced Channon and Chris into the back seat of the Toyota. Although they had all scattered, police were able to round up the other 4 suspects in the murders. They all faced a slew of charges, including felony murder, aggravated kidnapping, aggravated robbery, and aggravated rape.
Prosecutors announced that they were seeking the death penalty against some, but not all of the 5 suspects if they were convicted. Some only faced life sentences. Randy Nichols, who was Knox County District Attorney General at the time of the trials, told WCNC that this was a wicked crime and added that it was one of the most horrific crimes that the district attorney's office had ever endured. He added, "You start to wonder how someone could do this kind of stuff. What kind of person could do this to another human?" Now, there are endless arguments for and against the death penalty, but this is certainly the kind of case in which prosecutors typically seek the death penalty due to the gruesome nature of the murders and the torture and pain inflicted on the victims.
During trials, additional information came out. A woman named Ethel Freeman testified that the floral fabric used to bind Channon and Chris had once belonged to her. She sold it to Lamarcus Davidson, along with some used furniture that he never paid her for. Davidson was supposed to pay Ethel between $75 and $100 every other Saturday in exchange for the furniture he purchased but never paid for. On January 6th, a payment was due. Ethel was expecting Davidson to come to her apartment at the Washington Ridge Apartments, where Shannon's friend Kara lived, between 10 and 10:30 that night to pay her. He obviously didn't have it or didn't feel like paying it. Instead, he drove to the same apartment complex and chose random victims to abduct and murder. It was also revealed that on Sunday the 7th, an employee working for the landlord of Davidson's house visited to try and collect the rent. Davidson didn't have it. Of course, when they came back a few days later to try to collect again, the house would be a crime scene. So Davidson, who was known to do cocaine, was broke and feeling a lot of financial pressure. His girlfriend had moved out, adding even more pressure. Perhaps financial gain or a simple carjacking was the reason for the attack on Channon and Chris, but it quickly went sideways and into something much, much darker.
Lamarcus Davidson's ex-girlfriend, Daphne Sutton, also provided damning details. She said that on Sunday, just hours after the abduction, and possibly while Channon was still alive, Lamarcus Davidson told her that he wanted to give her some clothes. These included the clothes Channon had prepared to donate, as well as the jeans she had been wearing when she was abducted. At trial, Daphne broke down on the stand when she was shown the jeans. At the time Daphne was given the clothes, she had no idea they belonged to someone who had been inside the home and was being assaulted. She did, however, suspect that Davidson had another woman over, and he was trying to hide her. He told Daphne he would have clothes for her in about 30 minutes, but she headed straight over. She noticed that a chair had moved from the kitchen into the bedroom and was placed in front of an air mattress she had left behind. Daphne said that no one was in the bedroom, but Lamarcus's brother, Latalvis Cobbins, and acquaintance George Thomas were in the living room.
It was at this point where Daphne grew a little suspicious, so she tried to get into the bathroom, saying she wanted her makeup back. The door was locked. Lamarcus told her at the time that Vanessa Coleman was in the bathroom, but Daphne didn't believe it. He tried to give her a Sears bag full of clothes, money, and a ring. She only accepted the clothes, not realizing they were used. She tried to go through the bathroom's second door, which was through the kitchen, but Davidson stopped her. He grabbed her and yelled at her, telling her it wasn't her house and she didn't live there anymore, and he threw her out. At the time, all she was thinking was that Lamarcus had a woman over. Later that day, Daphne realized that the bag of Sears clothes was just used clothes in a Sears bag. She kept a pair of jeans and a few other items and then called Davidson and told him to come get the rest of them. He drove Shannon's Toyota 4Runner to pick up the clothes. The stickers were still on the car at that point.
So some of the witness statements were damaging to the defendants. But as far as physical evidence, there was no DNA and there were no fingerprints from Eric Boyd or George Thomas at the crime scene. However, Davidson and Cobbins were definitively linked to the murders because despite the attempts to destroy evidence with bleach, a DNA profile from semen found in Shannon's mouth was a match to Cobbins, and DNA elsewhere in her body matched Davidson. A written journal entry detailing the attack that matched Vanessa Coleman's handwriting was found in the home. It detailed what an adventure it had been and how much she had enjoyed it, as well as how much she had learned. It came out at trial that from the time the suspects got back from dumping Chris's body near the train tracks and until Shannon was placed into the trash can, the group sat around the house smoking weed, sleeping, and going back and forth into the bedroom where Shannon was being held.
So you said it, Morf. There were some witness statements that were damaging, but then you have to talk about this DNA. The group had gone to some lengths to try to destroy potential evidence, but DNA found in Shannon's mouth and on her body matched two of the suspects. I mean, I think from a jury standpoint, that's about as damaging as it gets. And then you have to talk about this journal. You have a woman, Vanessa Coleman, who is essentially transcribing the events that took place. And it also sounds as though she was doing so in a way that made it seem like she was enjoying what was going on. And that caused a real sickening feeling inside of me.
Yeah, I think it really proves just how depraved this group of people were and what they did to Shannon and Chris.
Yeah, we knew from the state that Shannon and Chris were found in, that what happened to them was horrific. But then to find out that such pleasure was taken in inflicting this type of torture and abuse, that adds an entirely different element to the crime, in my opinion. The first to be tried, Eric Boyd, was found guilty in federal court in April 2008. A jury agreed that he assisted Lamarcus Davidson after the murders. He was sentenced to serve 18 years in prison. Later that year, in October, the home at 2316 Chipman Street, where unthinkable horrors unfolded, was purchased by Waste Connections and demolished. A tree in honor of Shannon and Chris was planted on the street, and a memorial was placed outside of the former site of the home. The Waste Connections parking area has been expanded onto part of the land.
The following year, in August 2009, Talvis Cobbins was found guilty of murder and the facilitation of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 2 months later, in October 2009, Lamarcus Davidson was found guilty of 35 counts, including murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and robbery. The jury recommended a sentence of death. 2 months after that, George Thomas was found guilty of 38 counts, including murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Finally, Vanessa Coleman was found guilty of sexual assault, kidnapping, and facilitation in Shannon's murder. She was sentenced to serve 53 years in prison. It was believed that while the men left the house to take Chris to the train tracks where they killed him, Vanessa Coleman watched over Channon and held her against her will until the men returned. Out of all 5 participants, only Lamarcus Davidson was sentenced to death.
So 5 people were held accountable for these awful crimes, and while that could never bring back Channon and Chris to their families, it hopefully gave them some sense of justice or peace. But if it did, it didn't last long. Unfortunately, all of these sentences and convictions were put in jeopardy after Judge Richard Baumgartner stepped down due to misconduct. It was revealed that he was having an intimate relationship with a woman who was going through the drug court program that he supervised. And during that relationship, he was actually getting pills from her for his own addiction. He received a diversionary sentence, but it put all of his cases under scrutiny, including the 5 people convicted in this case.
The request of George Thomas and Vanessa Coleman for new trials were granted. Both were convicted again by a second jury, but received lighter sentences. In November 2012, Coleman was sentenced to serve 35 years in prison, and in May 2013, Thomas was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 51 years. Requests from Latalvis Cobbins and Lamarcus Davidson for new trials were eventually denied, and their convictions were upheld. Cobbins will spend the rest of his life behind bars, and Davidson remains on death row. In 2019, Eric Boyd was found guilty again, this time in state court. He was convicted of first-degree felony murder, first-degree premeditated murder, especially aggravated robbery, especially aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated rape, and he was given 2 life sentences. At the end of the day, all of the people responsible for abducting and murdering Channon and Chris have been held accountable and punished. But that doesn't bring them back to their families, and it can never erase the details from their minds of what happened to Channon and Chris.
Channon and Chris's families hope to focus on their memory and not dwell on the monsters that took their lives. Shannon's mother, Dina Christian, told WCNC.com, "I don't ever want anybody to forget Channon and Chris. Those were 2 wonderful kids with great, bright futures who did nothing wrong." In 2014, the Chris Newsom Act was passed in Tennessee. This act eliminated what is called the 13th juror rule that requires a judge to sign off on a jury's verdict before it is official when it is a unanimous verdict. This is because when Judge Richard Baumgartner's addiction became public, he had not yet signed the verdict forms, and the judge replacing him could not be a 13th juror at a trial he was not there to see, leading to all of those retrials.
The Channon Christian Act has also been passed. This stems from the defense's assertion at Davidson's trial that Channon and Chris willingly went to his house to buy drugs in an attempt to paint them in a negative light, and also explain why his DNA would be in her car. The jury heard the victims be disparaged, but due to laws that protect the rights of defendants, Davidson's prior conviction for carjacking was not allowed into the trial. Now, the Channon Christian Act protects the rights of victims, who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Every year, the Chris Newsom Memorial Baseball Tournament raises funds for a scholarship fund given to students at Halls High School, where Chris was on the baseball team. There's also an annual Shannon Gale Christian Foundation Memorial Golf Tournament that raises funds for scholarships. This year, the scholarship was designated for a young lady that has or will be graduating from a local high school in 2024 and will be attending the University of Tennessee as a freshman. I think it's safe to say that the memory of Channon and Chris lives on, as does their legacy, while the group of people who ended their lives are all but forgotten as they rot in prison where they belong.
And I think that's a very important point, Morf, that you make. You think about victims in some of the cases that we do, they are loved by so many people. And you often see these types of things after a tragedy. You know, families start scholarship funds or, different types of things in that person's name. Their legacy is going to live on, while you have this group of people who chose to commit what you would have to say were absolutely horrific crimes, yes, we had to say their names for the sake of telling the story, but few people are going to remember them. And if they do, it's not going to be a fond remembrance. As you said, these people are going to rot in prison, and they should. It's exactly where they belong. And as with every case, we don't have every single detail, but what we do have paints a picture of two young people who, were trying to have a good night out. They certainly didn't go over to that house to buy drugs, as was painted by the defense. They were, essentially carjacked by a group of people, led by, I believe, Lamarcus, who, as we detailed, was facing some financial pressures. Was that the impetus for what happened? He needed money, and he felt as though, this was a quick way to get it. Even if that was the case, though, the thing that sticks with me is that there was no reason to do all of the terrible things that this group did to Channon and Chris. If it was about money, they could have taken everything they had, taken, the Toyota 4Runner, and that would have been the end of it. But there were a lot of sadistic elements of what they did to these two young people that went, in my opinion, much further than just financial gain.
And this makes me think about the same thing that I think about often when we talk about crimes where there's multiple people involved. How does somebody not come to their senses and say, we can't do this? This is very serious. Not justifying that a carjacking isn't serious, but if it started out as a carjacking, robbery, or whatever, and changed to a kidnapping, rape, and murder, double murder, then, that's a whole different level of bad. And for not one person to stand up and say, I don't want to be part of this, I'm leaving, or to talk to the other people and then not doing anything like that, it's disturbing that nobody had the right state of mind to do that.
Well, and I'll take it a step further. You have someone like Vanessa Coleman. Not only did she not step up and say, this is wrong, don't do this, she sat down and chronicled the events of the night as though they were on, some type of once in a lifetime adventure. She took pleasure in what was going on to the point where she felt as though she needed to record it in written form. That really stands out to me.
And the one thing that I take away from this case too is the terrible things that were done in that house by this group of people. It makes me cognizant of, a rule that I tend to follow, and I advise my wife and kids to follow if they ever find themselves in a situation, to not be taken away from an original location. If you're ever attacked, make your stand where it happens at, put up your fight there, because if you're taken away, there's a great chance that things are going to get much worse for you. So, and it's easy for me to say that from behind a microphone without a gun pointed at me, but looking at it after the fact, I think it's clear that they may have had a chance to get away, to scare off the group had they ran, screamed, whatever, when they were initially attacked. But once they were in that house and subdued, tied up, there was no chance of escape for them. And the result was a death that I wouldn't even want to imagine.
Yeah, it's a good point you're making. I also think it can kind of be a double-edged sword, right? If they thought this was a carjacking, and like you said, I don't want to downplay that crime because it's not a good one. It's a far cry from what ultimately happened. But if they thought it was a carjacking and they thought their best chance was to comply, I could understand that. Hey, give up your car, give up your your wallet, whatever it is, just don't hurt us. And there are some criminals that would operate in that way. But at a certain point, there had to have been the knowledge that this wasn't just a carjacking. This was going further. And to your point, when does somebody make the decision to comply or to put up a fight? Because if you put up a fight, that can lead to serious consequences when maybe none were going to happen. If you get my point there, it's a tough one, and you can look at it case by case, and obviously there's the heat of the moment. There's everything that's going on. Is everyone thinking clearly? But it is something to think about ahead of time. Don't wait till you're put in a scenario where you have to try to figure it out. I think it's important for people to think about these things ahead of time so that in the unlikely event something like this happened to you, maybe it would be a little easier to think on your feet because you've thought about it ahead of time. What would I do in this situation? What would I do if this happened to me? Now, again, like you said, Morf, it's easy to talk about these things from behind a microphone, but I still think it's important to talk about.
And hopefully nobody listening ever finds themselves in a situation like, Channon and Chris found themselves in, but it doesn't hurt to have some kind of inkling of what you might do if you do find yourself in that situation. The one thing I'm very happy about this case is that these people did not get away with this, and we're not talking about an unsolved cold case. They were all arrested, tried, convicted, and they are right where they belong, in my opinion.
Well, and I think one of the big reasons for that is because they essentially did nothing other than trying to destroy some evidence. But for the most part, they didn't do a lot to try to get away with this. Or what they did do was sloppy. Like we said, police kind of were able to gather quite a bit of evidence pretty quickly. The other thing that I would say is that, this is a very well-known case, especially in that part of the country, in the Tennessee area. But over the years, it has become a case that a lot of people have latched onto.
And it goes to show you that this kind of crime can happen anywhere if you happen to cross paths with the wrong person or persons.
But that is it for our episode on Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. If you love the show, but haven't done so yet, go out, give us a 5-star rating, leave a review. Also, keep telling your friends. Word of mouth about the Criminology podcast really goes a long way.
If you want to find us on social media, we're on X with the handle Criminology Pod. You can also find us on Facebook by going to facebook.com/Criminology Podcast. And you can join our Facebook discussion group, Criminology Podcast Discussion and Fans.
So that's it for this episode of Criminology, but Morf and I will be back with all of you next Saturday night with a brand new episode. So until then, for Mike
and Morf,
we'll talk to you next week.
Take care, everyone.